All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Seed free seminar for the month of March. We're going to be covering principles in BP debating. Some of this will be cross-applicable to other formats. But yeah, we're going to cover what principles are. We're going to cover how to make them and specifically when to make them, because I think, unfortunately, there's often a problem where a lot of debaters will hit this sweet spot where they will spend time in their speech on something that's ostensibly a principle, but they won't make the analysis in a super compelling way, or they won't give it enough time for it to really do much. So they end up spending time on the principle, but not enough time that it actually ends up helping them. So we're going to talk about how to avoid that, as well as just sort of some common types of analysis that you can slot into motions in different contexts, and when those are useful. I'd also recommend there's a lot of other good seminars on principled analysis, particularly one on YouTube by Dylan McCarthy, who's phenomenal debater, who some of this is kind of whose sort of seminar I also got a lot out of, and so some of this will be lifted from that, just to give due credit where it's warranted. Let's jump into it. So first, before we cover principles and how to make them, we need to have an understanding on what the term means and what people kind of mean when they use it in a debating context. Because a lot of the time there's going to be a mismatch between philosophical terms and debate terms. And here we're only talking about principles in a British parliamentary debate context. So there's going to be many times in which we're going to be leaving philosophy aside. We're not going to be getting into a lot of philosophical terminology or philosophical literature. This is purely a seminar about debating. So if I say anything that is very wrong, for those of you who are familiar with the philosophical literature, don't worry, we're not getting into that. So what is the difference between principle and pragmatic? And this is the big thing that I think if there's one concept you need to understand, it's this one. Um, and it's that a principle analysis is basically anything that's what we'd call non-utilitarian, which is just non-pragmatic. So pragmatic ideas or pragmatic benefits in debate are most arguments, and they're anything that you can boil down relatively easily to some quantifiable benefit. So it's you're making money more, you're ensuring people don't go hungry, you're ensuring people have access to medicine, you're making cool stuff for people to do. All of this is pragmatic, which means it's like in the real world, it's very grounded. If I buy someone a laptop and that laptop makes them happy, they can watch YouTube videos like this one or whatever else. That's a very pragmatic benefit because it's very easy for us to understand. So when we're explaining it and we're explaining why you should vote for us getting more people laptops, it's relatively simple, I think, to quantify what the good stuff a laptop gets you is. Principles are a little bit more complicated because they are something a lot of us intuitively feel is valuable, but it's not as easy to explain what the value comes from or why it's something we care about. So, as an example, there's going to be a lot of examples in this seminar to kind of help us walk through this difference between principled stuff and pragmatic stuff. Is the concept of lying to make someone feel good. So I'm sure we're all familiar with, this kind of situation. It happens a lot in real life. Often people will kind of want us to lie to them, or we might feel we should lie to them, or it might be very inconvenient if we don't lie to them. But we also feel that lying is often sometimes wrong. So imagine, you have a friend and they're asking about what people think about them, and maybe you invited them to your birthday party and they saw a bunch of other friends who they don't know, and they were like, what did people at the party think about me? Did they think I was cool? And maybe everybody at the party thought that they were lame. um it would make them feel pretty bad to tell them this, but maybe we should anyways, because we should value the honesty we give our friend. Maybe manipulating them because we think we know what's better for them is like a wrong thing to do, and it kind of violates the trust we have with them. So that concept of like telling the truth, even if it hurts someone's feelings, is at its core the type of distinction that principled analysis is trying to get at. So it's sure the thing which makes your friend feel better is to be honest, but that's maybe still not right. So the pragmatics would be this is what is honest. The pragmatic is to lie, but that's not honest. So we should uphold the principle, or like, you know, we should do what's not pragmatically beneficial anyways, even though it produces um more sort of like suffering, or it makes our friend feel bad, because it's just we're treating them in a way that's right. So there's lots of ways you can get into principled analysis. That's just one, but that's the basic distinction we want to get at here. So when you're thinking about running principled stuff, when you actually want to run one of these types of arguments, like the one in kind of um, not lying to your friend, even though it's wrong, even though it makes them feel bad. So the answer is not often. Um, most debates are going to be pretty pragmatic focused. If you're talking about economics, most of the time we're going to be talking about pretty simple ideas. We're just talking about how we want to orient society, so how we want to organize people's work so we can get the most done. Furthermore, a lot of the time it's just not very useful to run a principle because it is kind of very abstract, or it you're trying to do too much. Most of the time simple elegant arguments are the good ones, so those are the things we want to kind of focus our time and energy on. So if you're kind of like, I'm not really sure what we can do, I guess we can just run a principle. If it's half-hearted, don't bother running it. You should be very, very certain that strategically it is a good thing to include in your speech. So don't like run one because you can't think of anything better. Just keep thinking, don't run a principle in this context. And as well, be really careful about running principled analysis when teams are just going to agree with you. So in the case of like lying to save your friend's feelings, there it would be useful to say that you shouldn't lie to your friend because it helps, the other team inherently has to defend lying. Um, in a lot of other contexts, like say if you're trying to argue in, criminal, you want to argue a tough on crime policy, and you run a bunch of stuff on here's why it's really, really important to help protect people from being victimized. You want to be careful that another team can't just agree principally that, justice is really important, and then just argue that they can fulfill justice better because, maybe tough on crime policies produce more crime counterintuitively than they support. So anytime you want to make some principled case for an argument or for an impact, make sure that a team can't just go, I agree, we fulfill this principle better, and then simply move on and then not have to engage with any of the analysis. So ensure that analysis is helping you win. This is why I say it's really important to ensure that there are some clear strategic benefits to this argument that you're going to spend time on if you do indeed want to run it. So what contexts should you run a principle then? Well, principles are useful to run in, I think, these contexts. And there might be others we could think of, but I think these are ones that it's useful to keep an eye out for when you're in a round, because this is when you want to give this kind of analysis, and when I think you would want to use the word principle again, because we're just talking about debate here. This is when we'd go, here's some principled stuff, judge. So the judge listens and it's like, okay, this is principle. Okay. So 4 examples here. We'll walk through these in a little bit more detail in a second, but the first is when they help to support your pragmatic impacts. So that's to say you have this kind of impact that's different from other teams' impacts, and we're gonna, explain that this impact we think is really good. So a lot of the time we can jump in and do principled kind of analysis and go, we think that this principle is a reason our pragmatic impact is really good. In addition to all of the other sort of impacting that you're probably used to doing in rounds, this is, our pragmatic impacting here, but also there's some principle that makes this doubly important. So, maybe there's other reasons, not lying to your friend might be good, and then we also explain that we uphold this principle when we're impacting this to help us kind of explain why our impact is important. And similarly, a lot of the time, debates will kind of become a wash. So principles can be useful to kind of help weigh rounds that have been kind of like, when we say wash, we just mean that like both teams are pretty equally compelling on who gets like more housing or who gets like less crime. Both teams give good reasons. So we're going to use this principle to kind of explain why, even if things are like a 50-50 wash, we have a principle and the other team doesn't. So they should vote for us as well. Um, so it's a tipping the scales in your favor kind of idea. Principles are often really useful as well when they can kind of break open the debate. I'll explain what that means, but basically it's when teams are all clashing on different kinds of things, and we just have this radically different conception that other teams aren't ready for, or other teams maybe didn't preempt on front half, that is going to take the debate in a whole new perspective. Um, Principles can be very useful here. And then, of course, um, sometimes the motion just outright requires principled analysis. So here, you'll sometimes see motions like this house believes that this type of thing is justified, right? Well, that sort of inherently requires you to answer some philosophical questions about what types of behavior are justified and what things being justified means. And this is going to be what judges are looking to see. So make sure, and this is, I think, the most important one not to forget, don't just autopilot into pragmatic impacts and stock arguments and stuff. Really ask yourself, what is the motion asking me for? And sometimes that is going to be a principled debate. So when that happens, make sure you have a little bit of familiarity. And I think it helps to practice running some principled analysis in those kinds of circumstances so that when you get a principled motion, you know a little bit how to handle yourself. Um, so let's jump into supporting pragmatics, because I think this is one of the four things we were talking about. So using principled analysis to weigh your pragmatic impacts against others. A common example of this is when people do vulnerability analysis. So they'll say our case is one that impacts, say, people of color or women or some other sort of minority group who is structurally disadvantaged in society. Um, why does that matter, right? We might ask ourselves that question. And a lot of the time, teams stop when they're impacting their case. They just say, we impact this vulnerable group, and then they stop talking as if that was sufficient. And a lot of judges will think that is, but we can make our case seem a lot better by also then jumping in, going to, going the extra mile and explaining, well, structurally, marginalized communities haven't been treated well by the state. Maybe the state hasn't fulfilled its promise to them. Maybe the state has been obviously oppressive to these groups, perhaps is even still oppressive. Perhaps as well, for reasons like racism or colonialism or misogyny, these groups of people don't have as much opportunity as other people. And we kind of explain this sort of stuff, this sort of like critical analysis to explain why this community matters more than other communities. And of course, this thing about like obligations and making up for past injustices, is all sort of in the realm of principled analysis. And we can explain that, we use terms like principally, this is why our impact is more important than other teams' impacts, which might just extend to other communities. And that is how we really sell impacts to vulnerable groups. Or similarly, if you wanted to impact to animals, you would explain principally why animals are important and why they're something that we should care about and we should value. And that allows us to kind of sell that impact. So when I say that principled analysis can be useful to support a pragmatic case, I mean that in impacting, we make our pragmatic impacts seem more important by weighing their relative value through the use of principled analysis, by getting into why we value this kind of thing. Um, Principles are very useful in that kind of way. It's not to say that this would be a completely independent principled argument, just that principled analysis supports the impact that presumably we have spent some time reaching. Weighing out a wash. So a lot of the time teams will, I think this is very useful in like formats that are just prop versus op, but you'll often have debates get very messy. So having an independent principled argument, which we'll explain a little bit how to make, can be useful as that sort of 50% plus this principle idea to weigh your team above the other team. So strategically, it can be helpful to have a principle, even if it's not established, it's not like the most thoroughly constructed one ever. It can sometimes be helpful to just point to that principle as a reason your team's arguments are unique, or a reason your team's arguments have just a little bit more going on than your crossbench. Make sure it actually is true that a lot of things have been washed out relatively well, and most of the time it's better to just try and not have stuff washed out. But I think it's often a useful strategic implication to just go like, hey, both of these arguments are pretty compelling. Both teams are pretty good. It's likely the case you're not super sure whether, say, one team will have more housing or not, but we also fulfill some principle. We also have this principled argument on why, maybe the state shouldn't take people's property or something. So ultimately, we think that you can vote off of that if everything else is washed. And a lot of judges will find that kind of analysis relatively compelling. So, imagine some hypothetical motion on repossessing people's land for development. Is this going to help us get more housing, or is it not going to help us get more housing? Well, either way, it's wrong to take people's property without their permission and without their consent. And if it's not really clear that government is getting tons of more housing, this principle will outweigh the other team. So that's sort of the an example of what weighing out a wash would look like. Um, uh, okay, so next we'll talk about how principles can often be used to do what I kind of call break open a debate. That's to say, when they can be often really, really useful on back half, kind of pushing something. Let me just close that. Uh, when you can disregard all of the pragmatic material that teams are putting forward and fully commit to running principled arguments. So I think this is super useful in closing opposition, um, or kind of in motions that are very philosophical, because in CO, you kind of get to say something without really clashing with anybody. So one thing you can do is, especially if pragmatic arguments are good and opening oppositions maybe given all of the strongest rebuttal to teams so far, is you can just go, look, I mean, just forget about pragmatics. Here's this principle, and let's weigh this principle like crazy and focus on making it really, really well. Then a lot of teams may not have really anticipated that. So their cases aren't going to have a ton of weighing, against your principle. The government bench only has one speech that they get to say anything about that. Government whip might not have a ton of responsiveness. So you kind of get to come in with this whole new idea and throw everybody for a loop. And so strategically, it can be a really good idea to run principled stuff there because it can weigh really well against other teams, and they might not get to say a lot about it because you're coming in after everybody has already had this pragmatic debate, and you just go, well, hey, here's this new idea, um, and suddenly, you get to say a whole bunch of new things. So when it's completely unique, it can be very useful to do this, which is also why I think it's sometimes good if there's like a pretty compelling principled argument to just make it somewhat quickly on front half to avoid back half teams being able to just extend a principle off of you and run it really, really well. Um, so let's talk about how you actually make principles. Now that we've sort of discussed a little bit about the kinds of contexts um, in which you might want to make them. So yeah, how do you actually bring up principles? So first is to know strategically why you're doing it so that you can explain to the judge how you think this principle fits into the round. So avoid just running a principle just for fun. I mean, if you want to run it for fun, then run it for fun. But if you want to run it to win, don't be running it just because you think it's fun. So if you have a really good conception on why this is strategically the best decision, then it'll be very, very easy for you to explain to the judge how they should judge it because that's the reason. It's the same reason, right? Um, and make sure you establish what the principle is. So when we're like, okay, we're going to make a principled argument or we're going to give some principled analysis for our case, um, establish what it is. Don't just say now a principled argument and then start saying things. Try and provide a kind of thesis statement for the argument. So if the argument is like human life, should never be sacrificed for the greater good or something. Like, okay, well, that's a thesis statement. That's something we can get behind. Or like perhaps human freedom is the most important right of all, right? Like these kinds of things, which might sound a little silly, but if we're giving an argument, it'll be a little bit more reasonable, I hope. um what's another good example? Or say for classic kind of motion where there's a lot of principled analysis to give would be something about legalizing drugs. We could go, hey, look, we think that people have the right to consent to things that are bad for them. Okay, sure. Um, that's a thesis statement. It's relatively clear how it would relate to the topic of drug use. And now we understand where this is going. And then hopefully we have a lot of very smart things to say after that, explaining why that principle is true and why it's applicable. Um, Make sure that you're not lazy and taking shortcuts. A lot of the time, people will kind of just give stock analysis. They'll say, why something is true, and then you'll be listening to it, and it'll be a little obvious that maybe they've made this argument before or they heard this argument somewhere and they're sort of ripping it off. Um, Try not to do this. Try and make it really relevant to the motion at hand. So say if you want to argue, you shouldn't lie to people, don't just give like, the classic deontological arguments against lying and people shouldn't be a means to an end. Focus on the actual topic and engage with the motion in front of you and try and make it very sort of related to the motion in front of us. So try not to take shortcuts and really ask yourself, what is the principle I have for this motion? Why is it relevant here? And what is the best way I can explain the importance and the applicability of this principle in this instance? Use examples and try and get people to actually care about it. So one thing you might have noticed I've been doing throughout this seminar is we've used a lot of examples in order to sort of prime you for a response. So when we talk about lying and I want to explain why sometimes, you shouldn't lie to people, I use the hypothetical person who goes to a birthday party and is very annoying. We can all imagine a person like that. Maybe some of us are that person. I've certainly been that person before. But the point is like, now instead of going hypothetically, people don't like to be lied to, even if other people know what's good for them. No, I don't know what that means. You're just saying words at me. Instead, we go, imagine you're in this situation and everybody's laughing at you behind your back and you never know about it. Well, now I'm imagining myself in that situation and ooh, man, it feels kind of gross. It feels kind of icky. I feel bad, geez, I would hate to be that guy, right? Now, because we related the principle through an example, I understand why we care about it, right? So, um, similarly with housing and taking away people's property, we go like, imagine, your family lives on a plot of land for 7 generations or something, and it gets taken away from you, and all you want to do is live there, and oh, the government's forcing you out. It's like the beginning of Pixar's Up, if you guys have ever seen that movie. You just want to stay in this house more than anything. So examples are very useful. I mean, examples are always useful in debate to get people to care, but especially for a principle, it's very important to help establish what our moral intuitions are. And if we have moral intuitions that aren't pragmatic, so if those moral intuitions are like, we care about respecting other people, or we care about giving people the freedom to make their own choices, examples are ways to fast track your audience's brain into accepting the conclusion that this principle is something that should be important to them and that they should care about. So um, we can use those in order to establish either the existence or the applicability of a principle, but it's important to ensure that that's not all we're doing. So when we go, you should sometimes not lie to people, and this brings us to our second point, is I think it's also important to acknowledge the limits of principles. This is something I think people also often do that is not beneficial, is they're too bold. So they'll say, we have this principle, right? The state maybe shouldn't make you do things. And then it's like, well, but it should sometimes, if maybe the state should force you to follow laws and to maybe pay tax and to maybe get a driver's license before you operate a motor vehicle. And it's like, well, okay, hang on. The state shouldn't make you do this thing, but that's really bad, right? You don't want to be in that situation. So when you're making a principled sort of line of argument, it's important to just be realistic and be honest, and like, the state making you do things is bad. And if it's going to make you do things, you want to make sure the state has a really good reason to do so. And we don't think that this meets that bar, right? That argument is a lot more immediately compelling than just, you know, libertarian, GERD, state should never allow me to do things, right? Or I should just be able to do anything I want. Wah, wah, wah. That argument is a lot worse because it's very easy for teams to just go, what's the limit of this principle? You know, it's not unlimited. So, and then they explain why this meets the bar, and suddenly you're on the back foot, right? So it is occasionally okay to be absolutist. Like, if the motion inherently calls for it, like it's saying this house would never lie, right? Well, now you're in a tough position. You do kind of need to defend never lying, right? So we think it's always bad to lie to people. Okay. Well, you kind of have to make that argument because the motion carries with it that burden. So unless you're in a position like that, where the motion is forcing you to defend an absolute statement, which they rarely will because it's quite difficult to do that, just because it's easy to think of some counterexample where it might be okay to do something. Um, it's usually in your best interest to acknowledge when a principle isn't going to apply or how far you expect it to go, just to take away that obvious response to teams and make them actually engage with the argument you're putting forward. So a few ones, we're going to walk through a couple examples of how to make principles next. But these are just a few types of principled analysis or like common principled arguments that you're probably ought to at least know about. So one is agency, aka freedom. So this is basically like, in a lot of ways, kind of like the underpinning of liberal democratic society. It's just that if you want to do something, like, and you want to really bad, you should be allowed to do it, right? With some reason. But like, if some people want to do a thing, they should be allowed to do that. If a bunch of people want to get together and play tennis, or they want to, you know, go for a hike, or they want to start a business, or they want to move to a different part of the country, or they want to buy a boat, or they want, right? We can millions of examples. For the most part, unless it's, very criminal, or some sort of fringe hypotheticals, most of the time we think you should be allowed to do that. Um, Even in cases where sometimes it's bad, right? Like, as an example, owning a gun in most places in the world um, actually makes you more likely to be shot, because you could misfire the gun, or it could be taken from you, or whatever else. Um, but nonetheless, lots of people think that it's okay to put yourself at more risk, and to own the gun anyways. Or similarly, alcohol probably not good for people on the whole, probably a total social net negative, but lots of people want to drink it anyways, even though it's super unhealthy, like it's really bad for you. But we go, hey, you want to go ahead. You can do stuff that's bad for you. We're not going to be a nanny state above it, and be your parent and tell you what to do. um so this common concept of like, people should just get to do what they want, basically, as long as they're not hurting anyone. And a lot of the time in debates, this is going to be a very useful argument for you to understand. And something I think that's worth thinking about is, what would the extent of this be? What How far is too far? How much can someone do something that's bad for them before, we think it's a little too much, right? Can someone, take their own life? Can someone consume drugs that are incredibly bad for them and unhealthy? Can someone behave in behavior that is willfully dangerous, like driving without a seatbelt, or um, maybe going skiing in a very dangerous area of the mountain that hasn't been maintained properly, where there's landslides and stuff. Worthwhile to think about, because often debates will circle back to this common principled question of like, how much freedom is too much freedom? Why do we care about freedom? Why would we be okay with restricting it? And those kinds of questions. Another common one is kind of like the state power principle, which is like a frequent stock argument people will run. Essentially, this is just basically an argument for democratic control over governments. The idea is that because the state controls your life and sets laws and forces you to pay taxes and says drive within these lines, or we'll give you a ticket, and behave in a way we want, and don't go out of line, or we'll fine you, or we'll send you to jail, or we'll kill you if you resist, right? I mean, that's the reality of living underneath a government. And governments can sometimes be okay, and they can sometimes be pretty oppressive. um the idea is like, well, when you're under that system of sort of control and power, it's nice to have at least a little bit go in the other direction. So the state's stomping down on you, but you get to go out and you get to vote for um, whoever you want, basically. And so that little bit of control that you get as a citizen makes that relationship a little bit, principally better, because you get a little bit of that power back. This is generally like very common argument people have in favor of democracy, where a lot of the time people will ask like, well, that the quality of life in a lot of non-democratic governments at various points in history, and even now, is not too bad. And a lot of democracies don't do super good, and often fail, and wind up being pretty fragile, and not being super able to handle sort of power. So sometimes people ask, I think reasonably, what is the point of democracy? And this question, again, is one that we'll often circle back to in debates, whether they're principled or not. So the question of people's relationship to the state is a very useful one to know, and another one that I'd encourage you all to explore in your own free time. Uh, Thirdly, are obligations, specifically reparative obligations. You might remember earlier when I was talking about vulnerable group analysis, like minorities. When people want to impact these groups, they often don't do a very good job explaining why we care uniquely about those communities as opposed to anybody else. So obligations is a really good way to explain this. So the idea is that sometimes you take on responsibility and you agree to do something and you have an obligation to do it. That's sort of what the word is. And obligations could be, even if you don't want to, maybe you still should do something. So maybe I borrow a book from you and you're like, okay, but I'm going to leave the country in 2 weeks forever. I'm moving to a different country. So you got to give me back the book in 2 weeks. Maybe when it's 2 weeks, you're like, geez, I am loving this book. I'm still not done reading it. I really don't want to give it back. I think you probably should. You promised to give the book back. Your friend was like, I'm only going to give it to you on the condition that you give it back to me in 2 weeks. You should probably give him back the book, right? Um, that's a very simple person to person understanding of what an obligation is. From a state perspective, often the states do bad things, right? We can think of lots of examples of that. So a lot of the time we say, because a state did a bad thing, a state owes a reparative obligation. This is the logic behind, for instance, reparations, where in sort of the United States, a lot of people argue that African American citizens are owed reparations for slavery. So the government, the US government, should give Black people money, even if they're rich, even if it's Barack Obama, they should give them all some money as a community because of a reparative obligation that the state has. Because, the US state was so bad to Black people for so long that now, they should do something to make up for it. And of course, other states other than the United States, a lot of reparative obligations that are probably owed. Even states to other states, we could litigate as many of them as we wanted to, and we'd still have plenty to get through. But idea here is similar to the person to person reparative obligation or just obligation at all. The idea is that sometimes having promised to do something or having some reparative thing, or like, whether it's a promise or whether it's because you've done harm, sometimes there are reasons to think that some courses of action you just have an obligation to perform them, even if it's difficult, even if it's inconvenient, even if it's hard, right? Like, if you promise your friend that you'll pay them money, even if that friend wins the lottery, and they don't need the money anymore, well, you borrowed money from your friend, you should pay the money back, right? If you promise to do something, you should probably do it. I mean, it's not a crazy concept. That's sort of the idea of obligations, and again, a frequent one that you'll circle back to in a lot of debates. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about rights. These are also really useful in debate terms as arguments that can frequently come up. So the idea of a right, and again, we're going to avoid getting too into philosophy here. The idea of a right is that you have this base, and no matter what, really, that has to be there. If you have a right, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what the context is, that right should be upheld, all else even. So say you have a right to food. Being hungry sucks. People should have a right to eat. You should have food wherever you are. So if you're poor, if you're too poor to if you're too poor to buy food, then we should make sure somehow that food gets to you. Um, if you are too poor, maybe if you're a really bad person, you're really mean, you're the meanest person in the world, you should still have food, even if you're a jerk. Um, or similarly, if we think that you have a right not to be tortured, even if you're a really evil guy, don't torture the evil guy. Just put them in jail. It's fine. You don't need to torture them. Or, even if maybe information that could be useful for some ongoing military engagement, well, you just have an absolute right not to be tortured. So, we're just never going to get that. Maybe we'll have to try and get it from you another way. We'll just have to ask really nicely or offer you something or whatever else. We have to figure out another way to get it. So the idea here is rights are these like things that, irrespective of context, should be upheld and should be important and should be something we care about. Now you might ask, like, what happens when rights like interfere with one another? What are the limits of rights? How many rights are there? What would they be? These are all good questions, and ones that, again, debates will circle back to, and having some familiarity with like basically rights theory can be pretty useful in debate context. So feel free to circle around on them in your own time, but we don't have the time to get into the mires on rights theory. Um, let's go over two examples on how to actually run principled arguments before we sort of wrap this seminar up. So the first example is in online data harvesting. So you should probably all be familiar. If you're on YouTube, you are watching this on your phone or your computer or something, you agreed to some privacy agreement where you probably didn't read it and you clicked allow. And in that privacy agreement, basically all these applications are like, we have the absolute right to hold your data. We're going to want to, sometimes they ask if they can go through your pictures on your phone. They can have your location data so they know where your house is. There's some wild stuff they'll ask you sometimes to violate your privacy. And so let's imagine, we're having some kind of debate and it's like, should we stop, you know, companies from doing this? Should we uh sue them, or should we criminally prosecute, or imagine whatever kind of debate. But we want to make a principled argument that it's wrong to harvest people's data and to collect people's data online. We think it's a bad thing that companies do this. Okay, cool. So all right, who in the world cares about your data being harvested? Who actually cares? Okay. Well, how are we going to answer that question? How are we going to tell our audience that you have a principled right to, privacy, or to not have your data collected and sold? So one way we could do this is by explaining that, data is used to sell people stuff based on, their identity, or based on things that the, data brokers think they discern about you. So they might figure out that, I'm a man who lives in Canada who really likes debate. And so they're like, aha, I'm going to sell this guy, some type of thing that, I don't know, debaters in Canada like. Um, and as well, maybe data will kind of reveal things that people might want private. So the idea here is that, based on what that sort of data brokers suggest about you, they might reveal things that might be kind of private and that you might not want to have revealed. So what might examples of this look like? Because again, we're trying to sell the idea that we think people should have their data private. We don't want other people to be collecting this, or even an engine. So um some examples we might use to pitch this principle would be like LGBT identities, struggles with mental health, or sort of disordered behavior, these types of things that are very private. um Most people don't really, well, a lot of people are quite open about this, but for a lot of people, these are very private things that they like to keep hidden. And for the most part, I think most people understand why it would be a wrong thing for somebody to reveal this or for somebody to find this out about you without you knowing. And a lot of the time as well, your sort of search habits and your internet behavior make it quite easy for companies to figure this out about you. So, if you're LGBT, Netflix probably knows that because you probably consume more LGBT media than the average person. And, so they can recommend you more of that stuff. The idea is that maybe it's not great for corporations and for external actors to be able to figure out that you're gay if you don't want that to, or you don't want that to be public. That maybe you have a right for your sexual identity to be private and not shared to external actors. Or similarly, if you've struggled most of your life with an eating disorder or with mental health concerns, perhaps it's wrong for external people to be able to harvest your data and figure that out about you because you've Googled things like how to deal with depression or what to do when you're sad, or you watch YouTube videos where people talk about how you can overcome these problems. And then perhaps it's wrong for an external actor to figure that out and to use that against you, or to use that to harm you in some way, or even just to know that that it's an invasion of your private identity. So these examples are an effort for me to try and make you care about this idea of data harvesting. So when we say who cares, well, there are things that should be private to you and that other people should know about, or that people shouldn't be able to look in and figure out. That should be, a sort of cocoon, and that you should be allowed to keep things to yourself and for other people not to know them about you. Um, that's my attempt to make you care about this. Whether or not you think that worked, this is sort of the way in which we would want to go about principled argumentation. So we start with, why do we care about this? We try and find examples that illustrate why we care and that are going to get our audience to also care. And then we go and we explain why it's applicable and why in this context, this is when we would do our weighing and stuff. So that's kind of to walk you through an example. That's what principled analysis looks like. Let's do one more. This is freedom of movement during COVID lockdown. So this should be probably discourse a lot of you might remember. It was only 2 years ago. Um, but I'm sure you remember protests and lots of discourse about this. Um, Government said, you're not allowed to go places. You got to stay at home. And a lot of people were like, I'm going to go places anyways. I'm not staying at home. Right. That was the whole hubbub. So if we're on the freedom of movement side, so we're on the no lockdown side, um, we need to sell our audience that that's something they care about. Who cares about staying at home? Isn't it just like a vacation? Um, Now we all remember, that was a little rough, those couple years there. But I think if we're trying to really sell our audience about this, why they should care about people having the freedom to move around, well, again, let's look for good examples. So I want to go watch a movie. Not a great example. I want to go to the bar. Not a great example. But romantic relationships, church services, these I think would be a little bit more compelling because these are like very high value activities that lots of people derive a great deal of satisfaction from, right? People really care about their religion. People really care about their relationships. And denying people access to this is like pretty extreme, right? That's a big deal. So we take something that might sound superfluous, like your freedom to move around, and we use these examples to sell it to you and to say that no, your freedom to move around really really matters and is something that we care about. You should principally have the ability to do stuff if you want to. The state saying we are going to control your life is a massive violation for people. That's the idea, right? The example sells them on the concept, and now we say, COVID lockdown was just too much, or for whatever reason. And then we clash, we weigh against whatever the other team, the pro lockdown team, we weigh against them, and we say, actually, we think that these sort of things and this principle should be upheld, and we don't think risks to health or whatever is super super big. You'd mitigate that and weigh against that. But this is sort of a walkthrough on how you could try and apply the principle of freedom and freedom of movement in this context. So that's sort of this is where I'd ask questions, but this seminar isn't being given live, so there's no one here to ask questions. So that's been principles in British parliamentary debating. Hopefully that gives you some ideas on how to apply principles and when strategically they're useful, when they're not, as well as sort of some examples that maybe you can apply in your own debates. So thanks, everybody. That's been the seminar for March. I'll see you all next month. Same as always, second Tuesday of the month, and we'll have probably another speaker and a whole nother topic. So thanks, everybody. Have a nice day.